This video and podcast is brought to you by the Kulkarni Law Firm. Reach out to the Kulkarni Law Firm for advice on PRC review, MRC review, developing SOPs, training, audit compliance, and more. Reach out to Darshan at kulkarnilawfirm.com or call me at 302-252-6959. Or you can just visit our website at DarshanTalks.com or visit the law firm website at kulkarnilawfirm.com. That's KULKARNI lawfirm.com.
Wonderful to be here again. I get to talk to the one, the only Brad Hightower. Everyone knows him as the guy who has the pulse on the clinical research industry from the site perspective. It's you, it's Dan, it's both Dans actually, and everyone's having these conversations. So it's really exciting to have you, Brad. You and I have been talking now. You've done multiple interviews on this, so thank you so much. I can't wait to sort of get into this. But before we talk a little bit about the topic for today, Brad, you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, Darshan, always a pleasure. Appreciate you having me back on. My name's Brad Hightower. I run a site network, IRO. I don't even know what you call them anymore nowadays, but work with various physicians here, mostly across the Oklahoma City metro, and I run sites. I also do a podcast, Note to File podcast, and I'm just a general clinical trial junkie at this point. It's pretty much invaded every aspect of my being, for better or worse.
We have a topic that we want to get into, which is this idea of how do you land up in a world, in clinical research especially, where things are, it's essential that you demonstrate control of your processes. And what you have instead are 1,000 emails from 15 different vendors and 14 different sponsors, and all of these people all trying to communicate with you at the same time. And the result of it is as the site, you're expected to keep track of not only the study, but the version of the documents you're looking at. Talk to me a little bit about what you're facing at the site level. I mean, from the sponsor level, it seems so simple. I'm giving you everything you need and sending you the latest version. What more do you want from me?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think, I'm still dealing with a lot of the study startup and even regulatory, process myself for a lot of my different sites. So managing this is becoming increasingly difficult, across the different sponsors. If I'm trying to get 6 or 7 studies started up, it can become a mess when you're dealing with, getting shot all these zip files. Some of them make it through, some of them get hung up because of their size, whatever the case may be. You've got multiple team members from the sponsor or CRO emailing you different things. And then on the side, you've got, a budget and contract person who may or may not be looping me in. They may be sending it straight to my budget and contract, person here on my team. And so you end up with just pure chaos. And, you start shipping emails back and forth. Well, okay, my 1572, you know what? I misspelled Oklahoma. I got a little fast on my fingers. Okay, we need to redo it. Okay, and I got to go back and start that process over again. And really tracking that is just kind of up in the air, at least on the site side. Now, I have to go on a limb and assume that the sponsor or CRO side has something a little more put together in terms of tracking. But for sites, it's you're kind of on your own. And, of course, you can do it yourself. You can create your own process. But again, it's not really that. It's only a certain level of usefulness because that's not interfacing with your sponsor or CRO. I'll say this, look, I'm usually the last person to advocate for more platforms, but this is where I think a platform would be ideal, where you could actually have version control that both sides can see. Maybe you could track the progress. Maybe you can see, okay, you're 50% done. Maybe you can also map together some of these things, like I'm waiting to send back a ICF draft until I know what the subject compensation is. Well, do we even have a budget yet? Sometimes people are asking me for ICFs, and I'm like, hey man, I don't even know if we're paying patients. How much are we compensating them? Certainly everyone knows this, but again, we're not always communicating these things. So you stack that up. If you're working with a variety of sites with a variety of staff in a variety of locations, it becomes a big pain in the ass pretty fast. And, things get messy. It takes longer than it should, and it really starts to sort of drag everybody down. So, I talked a lot there, but I sort of start to question, like, to what degree would we be better served by having a shared platform or some sort of shared way to work between sites and CROs, instead of like, hey, we've got our process, you've got your process. Good luck to both of us. Maybe we'll get through this together.
I love that. What you're really describing is this idea that the entire clinical research process is held together by thoughts and prayers, and a little bit of sort of chewed up gum. But it's kind of critical, because in the end, the sponsors are coming through and they're auditing the site and going, show me this document, show me it's signed, show me this is going on, show me you have control of the process. So at the site level, it's obviously terrifying. The sponsor, let's be honest, cares, because the sponsor has a vested interest in making sure that the study is actually valid. But as you pointed out, there's no real standard out there on sharing this information. So let's talk a little bit about what that could look like. So you're talking about some of the big issues being tracking. What do you do right now for tracking? Are you using your own spreadsheet? Are you sort of just going through your emails and just tagging each thing? What is your current process?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, it's going to sort of reveal the lack of sophistication. I mean, a lot of times I'm printing or copying emails and just going down the list and checking things off as we complete them. So, easy, straightforward, very, very low tech. But again, we're using maybe like our OneDrive to, store our files and sort of keep at least some semblance of, version control going on, which is, again, not always super consistent. But again, I don't know why that couldn't be a more transparent and sort of living process. Like even something as simple like the concept of Google Drive, sharing that between sponsor and CRO, or site and sponsor/CRO, if you will. And you can see, okay, this is the last version that they uploaded. It's been, completed by the site. You can actually get some transparency into what both sides are doing here. And again, I don't understand why that hasn't become more prevalent, because I really haven't seen there's a couple systems that are, trying to do this. I think things like Viva and Cobalto maybe, but they have their faults, and they're certainly not adopted to the degree that they're seem to be making a dent in that. So, I've tried different things, frankly, throughout the years. I've used Asana, I've used different project management systems, I've used Microsoft Planner, but either way, again, a lot of that relies on a team that's on the other side. You know what I mean? So I'm waiting on documents, or I'm waiting on approvals, or I'm waiting on this from the other side. So again, it's you can do all you can on the site side, but there's still a missing piece of that puzzle. And I think that is some true either interoperability or just collaboration.
It's a great point, and it's one of those things that it's about collaboration. So I'm going to ask a different version of this question, because I've spoken to a mutual friend of ours, and during that conversation, I said, "Well, is there a need for this type of software?" And he went, "Darshan, you realize as a site, I may not want that level of transparency with the sponsor. I may not want the sponsor to know why I haven't signed a 1572 or that I'm holding off on XYZ, because then they're going to call me out on it, and that level of transparency exposes me to issues." What is your take on something like that? Do you think that it will add a level of sort of being responsible to each other, and is that a good thing, or are there some unspoken things between site and sponsor that maybe we aren't lifting the roof off or whatever it is and disclosing, if you will?
Yeah, no, I could understand sites having that hesitation. Frankly, I mean, if you have know anything about me, I'm sort of for a radical transparency almost at this point. So for me, I would rather just be all out with it. And I've even gotten to the point now where I do communicate that when people are asking me for startup documents, and I'm like, you know what? Right now, your budget looks like shit. So if it doesn't get any better, we're not going to move forward. So I'm not going to, complete a 1572 and fill everything out until I feel a little bit more confident in that part of the process. And, whether that's a good look or a bad look, I mean, it's the truth. And I think, again, we're likely to get a lot further down the road quicker if we're just transparent about it. But yeah, I can understand, again, sites seem to take this like pride in the fact that like we do things our way. And I can appreciate that to a degree, but I also think that, or I'm starting to believe more and more, like maybe we just need to get a little bit more standardized, even if that means we don't always get to do things exactly the way we want. And I know that even that sounds sacrilege to, myself from a year ago, but I'm starting to move a little bit further down that way of thinking.
So what you're saying is that we need to have that level of transparency. And what I like about what you're describing is there's going to be, as a result of what you're saying, and I expect it's happening to you as we speak, there are going to be sponsors who say, I don't want to work with you. And you're going, yeah, that's fine. It just means I don't have to deal with this. I'm not spending energy pursuing something that we both know we're not going to be happy with at the end of this process.
And, look, for again, as aggressive as we've been, and even sometimes, frankly, we've been rude to sponsors and been very transparent. I mean, very, very, very few occasions has it ever actually fallen apart. We can almost always find some way forward that is, we may not always be perfectly happy, but we at least feel, happy enough to go forward. And again, there's only been very few instances where sponsors have been like, no. And if we do, it's almost always about budget versus anything else. So, again, I don't see that becoming a problem. And again, to your point, maybe in those cases, then it's just sometimes not everything's a great fit. You don't need to take every study that comes your way. And that's hard for sites to hear. And it's hard for sites to act on sometimes. But again, ultimately, you've probably saved yourself a lot of pain if you can't get through those initial stages.
So who should, I mean, you're talking about this bubbling need for having a common platform. Who is the need from? Is it sites who are saying we can't deal with this avalanche of emails? Is it sponsors who are going, I need you to keep track of this stuff? Or is it CROs going, in the end, I'm dealing with both of you guys, and I'm trying to keep track of all of this? Or is it IRBs who are going, we have our platform, we don't need anything more? So where are we going?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I mean, in my, somewhat narrow perspective as someone on the site level, I mean, I think it's a need from the site side, but whether they know it or not, I think it's a need from everybody's side, and everyone would benefit from it. I don't know that I've heard a CRO or sponsor stand up and say, we need this, but I feel like it would potentially streamline things to a degree that they would receive obvious benefit from it. And look, I've gotten more than one occasion, we've gotten, the wrong versions of budgets from a CRO contact. And I'm like, hey, that's the one, that's 3 drafts ago. So, send me the correct one. And, if we had a nice collaborative platform in place, that wouldn't happen. It wouldn't set us back another 2 weeks before they respond to us with the correct version of the budget that they didn't give us.
So an ideal version of this sort of, I'm thinking through this with you, and I'll be blunt, I have a vested interest because I actually have a piece of software I'm developing as we speak on something similar. So just to be very, very clear and transparent about this. But so if anyone's actually interested, feel free to reach out. But besides that part of it, who do you think should pay for it? Should it be the sites? Should it be the sponsors? Should it be the CROs? Or is there sort of a nonprofit that everyone sort of puts money into, a pool, if you will, and then that pays for these types of systems?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I don't know that I have a great answer because, I mean,
let me rephrase. Should sites pay for this?
Again, it's a very slip slope. I mean, I think if I could get sponsors to use it, I would. I'm going to go out on a limb, and maybe I'll regret this later, but I would be happy to pay for it. I think if I could tell a sponsor, hey, you're going to use this platform, put your documents in it, and we're going to work through this collaboratively, and it's going to be, smooth for both of us. And, if that's a somewhat negligible cost, I think I'd be happy to pay it for the, for the lack of pain I feel from, shooting 30 emails back and forth over the course of, 2 months. I mean, so I wouldn't say it's outside the realm of possibility. I feel like, again, I don't see how it wouldn't benefit sponsors, maybe even more. Sponsors and CROs are dealing with hundreds or maybe thousands of sites.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't see why it wouldn't be in their vested interest for them to potentially build and fund that. But yeah, it gets tricky, right? Because the dichotomy is still very strange between site and CRO sponsor. I've never been able to tell a sponsor, you're going to use my system, but we're always told we're going to use your system. So, I don't know that we've got that clout yet at the site level.
I think you're right in that so I was thinking through that as I asked the question, and I was going, can a site really tell a sponsor what to do? And let's be realistic. At a realistic level, if that sponsor is Pfizer or GSK or J&J, you're probably not getting very far. But that startup who's starting out and is going, I don't know what I'm doing anyways, you're telling me this is the process to use, fine, let's go with it.
Right.
I can see a sponsor signing up for that. The problem you start having is Brad says use software X, and site number 2 says use software Y. You're now dealing with a sponsor who's now caught in the middle of managing multiple systems. So maybe it's the CRO that sort of pays into it and says, as part of, and this is a really interesting model as I just start talking through it, but I'm kind of going, what happens if the CRO says, you know what? If you participate in the study, part of your study budget goes towards paying for this software. And this is what everyone pays, and we're not keeping this money, this goes towards the software. It's an interesting angle, but I can see sites going, you're choosing to use the software, why am I paying for this? But it sounds like it could be mutually beneficial.
Well, I think it sort of brings us back to a bigger question that I keep hearing as I talk to people in the industry is, what's the future? Is it fewer but more all-encompassing platforms, or is it interoperability, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's still really unclear. I don't even know what I think would be, better. You ask me, depending on what day of the week it is, I'll probably give a different answer. But, I think that could play a big part in it. I mean, if there's enough M&A, we get down to just a couple of platforms, it may not be a big issue, right? But if we continue to sort of do like we talked about earlier, and sites are saying, no, we use this, and you've created a situation where, to your point, 100 sites are using 100 different platforms and insisting sponsors, I don't think we'll ever, see any positive movement in that, if that's the future.
It's interesting you say that. I did an interview very recently about the CARES Act, and under the CARES Act, interoperability is a new. It wasn't with you, was it? It was with someone. I forget. It literally was in the last few days actually. And the requirement was these systems have to communicate with each other. And we're talking about in the context of like an Epic and a Cerner trying to communicate with each other. But the result of it also is if you have patient information, maybe these systems need to be able to communicate with each other as well. And the result of that is maybe no system wins because all systems give you the same access. So you don't get these data silos, you get the access to the same information. But that's going to be kind of, it's not pie in the sky because it's live now, but I see a need that needs to be met. But the key portion of that is how do you tie all this information, this new system that's coming out, and tie it to the EMR? Do you see that as like a version 2, where you go, here's your tech to share documents with the sponsor, but you need to start tying that into our current EMR system so that we're not trying to take the same data, download it, and then re-upload it into another system? What do you see as a valuable set of tools in there that must be included for it to be valuable to you?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a good question. I don't know that I've thought that out very well. I mean, and another issue for me is I don't understand the tech enough to know how some of this stuff would or wouldn't work, and to what degree it would work versus being sort of terribly cobbled together. Because I think you run the risk of making it worse if things don't come over correctly, or if you end up with any other problems. And from what I understand, again, I have limited knowledge, but there's already some standard language or standard data on sort of the health record side of things, right? But that's still not really the case in broader clinical research. So, and again, maybe I'm speaking completely, out of left field here, but so I don't know what that would look like as the future goes. But for me, I would love it to be outside and related EMR, because I think, like, for me, I'm working with 6 practices with 6 different EMRs, right? And I'd rather have something that's agnostic to an EMR, because it's got to run potentially across all these different platforms. So again, I don't know that I'm smart enough to give you a good answer as to sort of what that would look like in an ideal world. But the more I think about it, the more in the weeds, the more kind of scared I get about what that could potentially look like in the future.
But that sort of raises that next question that you and I sort of hinted at as a topic before we jumped in, which was these systems that are out there. They all want to go after and solve the quote unquote clinical trials problem, but they're always based from the perspective of someone who's never worked in clinical research. And what I'm talking about is you were sort of in true Hightower fashion, went down the route of does EConsent represent what sites are actually expected to do? So talk a little bit about what your experience was versus what the technology expects you to do versus what legal expects you to do versus what you actually do.
Well, and so this also kind of speaks to a broader issue, is that as a site, I'm trying to go out and find technology that works for me as a site. So I'm looking at EConsent vendors as like a first kind of stop, because I think we have some places where it makes a lot of sense. But I'm trying to make, and maybe I'm thinking about it wrong, by trying to sort of make it analogous to the current process. Just, how can I sort of one-to-one this, right? Like, we do it this way. What is that? How does that translate? And, if you are somebody who's like, EConsent, great, here's a consent form, make it electronic. Well, maybe you don't understand that sites also go through a process by which they sort of document the actual process of consent, not just a signature. They're attesting to the fact that the subject's been given ample time to review a consent form, or that they've had ample opportunity to answer questions, that they were able to consult with their physician if they want to, that they were told about alternative treatment methods. And that's not really captured necessarily in the consent form itself. That's oftentimes a progress note or a separate document that sites maintain and which they're responsible for. Well, as I'm talking to EConsent vendors, I'm like, how do you capture that? Or do you? And I feel like a lot of EConsent vendors are like, well, they don't seem to understand or have never heard this even being brought up before, which is perfectly fine. I mean, it's, we got to start somewhere, but it starts to beg the question then, like, okay, our site's going to have to, again, start to cobble things together themselves. Do I have to still write on paper in addition to an EConsent? In which case, why even bother with EConsent? And if it's not really going to help or help significantly change the process. So, I mean, it's just one example, I think, of probably what's happening across a lot of these different these areas, especially with new vendors come in who are, look, they're not selling to us as a site, they're selling it to sponsors. And if you're not a coordinator or a CRA, you may not have that granular knowledge to be able to foresee the problems as they come up, and instead you're like, oh, cool, shiny EConsent platform, let's do it.
Yeah. What I like about what you're discussing is this idea that the person who buys the platform, i.e. the sponsors, are only looking at what documents do they need at the end of the process. They need a signed informed consent form. Great. But they're not responsible for tracking to make sure that the consenting process occurred in the same way. Now they'll audit you for it, but they aren't sort of monitoring it from that same perspective. It's kind of interesting and valuable going forward, because as you start looking at something like centralized monitoring, it would be very useful for for some kind of auditor to be able to go in and say, what was the time difference between the consent form being given and the consent form being signed? If it was done within an hour of each other and that was consistent across all the patients, well, maybe that's a concern. And then you come audit for that, as opposed to coming on site and you just happenstancing to sort of trip over that part of it. So it's an interesting sort of dilemma to get into the granularity. But the question then becomes, they being the vendors, the software vendors, need to have more communications with the sites to get that clarity. But if the site's never going to be the one to pay for it, why bother?
Yeah, no, I think you characterized it really well. And even in your example, like, again, maybe there's metadata that can show some of these things, like to your point. But, you know, if you can see that someone was sent a consent form and signed it 5 minutes later, that's going to raise questions.
Yeah.
Well, unless you have some other method to document. Well, actually, I sent them an electronic copy a week ago for them to review. But where can I put that in the EConsent process or EConsent platform? Or do I just need to go write a handwritten note or put it in my eSource somewhere? In which, again, I mean, what are we doing? We're not really making it easier. If anything, it's still another place to have to go put something. So, again, may seem like a small problem, but it's not. Especially if you're consenting. You know, some of these trials we have 200 pages. That's a lot of potential. You know, back on the site if they don't get it right.
The other thing that I find really fascinating and interesting about this is when I negotiate these clinical trials, you're really chugging that the drinks. Waking up,
caffeine in me, man.
just sort of inject caffeine into you as an IV. But no, I think a really interesting angle of what's going to happen in the future is this other thing that I'll end up negotiating every single time I negotiate a clinical trial agreement, which is how long should the site keep the documentation? And right now, the way the sites are dealing with it is, we're going to keep it for, again, there are multiple ways this gets negotiated, but one might be 2 years. One might be the minimum amount of time the state requires. One might be 10 years. One might be the time that the NDA gets filed plus 10 years, or whatever it is that they're going to use. As you start going into these electronic platforms, that's not something the site needs to do anymore. Theoretically, if done right, the sponsor's paying for that, to pay for the storage to do that. And if appropriately done, all the documentation is in one place, and the sponsor can say, I want this for the next 35 years, and I'm willing to pay for it. As opposed to the site having to go, I have a basement that has 50 failed studies and 2 completed studies. And that's a recipe for disaster as I see it. But I've never understood how sponsors accept that from sites, and how sites go, yeah, I'll take that risk on for the next 35 years. I may not even exist in 15 years, but whatever.
Right. Yeah, no, that's I mean, luckily not something I've had to really, obviously I had to deal with the fact of, or, being like, sorry, we don't exist anymore. I don't have your records. Good luck with them. But yeah, I mean, a lot of times at the end of the study, it's, here's your long-term storage, which is not very much money, depending on how long you have to store these things. And that's kind of the end of it, and then sites are kind of left. I mean, almost every site I've been to still has everything they've ever done stored somewhere,
Right.
I mean, I think sites get a little bit scared. They're like, am I allowed to do this? Do I need to reach out now? Who do I talk to? Who's going to say it's okay to, destroy documents? So sites are kind of left holding the bag really forever, almost at that point. But yeah, if it's done electronically correctly, there's no need for that anymore.
It's funny, like I look at this, and I've negotiated this contract with 4 sites multiple times. I inevitably go, you know what? Let's make it simple. You'll just pay for the cost of Iron Mountain. Whatever that cost is, you pay for it. And I have never once has that been accepted, because the cost of Iron Mountain is superbly high. It's ridiculous. And I don't even blame them, because Iron Mountain's going, I don't want to keep your crap for the next 50 years. Like, you're going to pay me every single year it's there. So, I've always tried to figure out how sites are expected to do it. But we can keep going down this path. We're already like 10 minutes past time. But Brad, this was amazing. Thank you so much for a great, great conversation. Before we go, any last parting words?
No, I just think, it's a really interesting time. I'd love, to your point at the very beginning, there's a lot of people at the site level now speaking up, being a lot more active in these conversations. So I'd really want to see, I'd love to continue to see, again, more transparency from the sites, talking about these different solutions and helping guide some of these new vendors, because I think it is important we get it right. And if we do get it right, we could see some significant change in a positive way. But if we don't, I think it's going to get really ugly, and it could be, even set things back unnecessarily. So, I mean, that's really it. I think if you're a site, you're dealing with technology, talk about it. Let's all talk about it, and let's be very, very transparent.
These conversations are not intended to be legal, regulatory, or clinical advice and may not be right for you. These conversations are intended for educational purposes only. Conversations on this forum do not create an attorney-client relationship.